ほら、ルフィ、今一緒に海賊になる仲間を探してるんだ。
Hello guys, welcome to my channel The Wandering Zoro, your go-to destination for anime-related content. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest videos. In today's video, we're going to be diving into part 2 of the series What If Quirkless Izuku Had the Abilities of the Overwatch Agents. So be sure to stick around until the end, and let's get started. The class of Aldera Middle School was bored out of their wits, staring absently at the blackboard their teacher was writing on. Many of the students' eyes wandered towards the clock above the door of the room, all waiting for the small hour hand to hit 3 to indicate the moment they can bolt out of the room. Few people were paying attention to the lesson, however the teacher seemed blissfully unaware of it. Or he didn't care. Who he failed or passed may not be a concern for him, as he could do what he want and get paid in full. Izumi was one of the many that didn't care what the teacher told about the lesson, but unlike the rest, she had her head down in her arms that rested flatly on her desk and was softly snoring. She needed to pay attention in this class, as she was barely scraping a pass. Yet Izumi couldn't find it within herself to care, and used her class time to get some extra shut-eye. Katsuki, top of the class, was also not paying attention. He hardly needed to. He could flunk the end-of-year test and still come out as the top student at the school, but that wasn't the reason for his scowl and loss of attention. Katsuki Bakugo rhythmically tapped his fingers against the wooden desk as he grumpily glared at an empty chair across the room from him, one that belonged to Izuku Yagi. Katsuki wasn't very fond of the boy, but it wasn't due to anything the boy had done. If anything, Katsuki had a weird form of respect for the quirkless loser, but that same weird respect he has for Izuku also gives Katsuki deep and unbridled hatred towards the greenette. His whole life, Katsuki had always been told he was destined for greatness. His peers and teachers said he had a quirk that could compete with All Might. Since then, those praises continued as Katsuki strived for perfection. Perfect grades, peak athleticism, and amazing quirk controls. He was the best compared to everyone else around him, and he knew he had what it took to be a hero. Everyone told him he was the best. But that had always upset Katsuki, because he knew they were lying. Lying to him to keep up the image that he was the best, and they were doing so by sabotaging someone who is said to be undisputedly useless. Worthless Deku. But if he was so useless as what everyone said he was, then why did they feel the need to make him seem worse, to make things even more difficult for him? If he was that pathetic, then he'd prove that on his own. Yet Katsuki had seen quite the opposite being displayed. Deku had been hammered with incredibly advanced questions that Katsuki had no clue on what the answer could possibly be, and consistently had the answers for them. He had also peered over at Deku's homework when others knocked it out of his hand, and noticed it wasn't anything like the sheets he had. The questions were far harder, and of a curriculum Katsuki hadn't heard of. It was ridiculous. Katsuki had said he was at the top of his school in every category, but that wasn't exactly true. Sure, grades indicates that Deku struggled, but that was with the boy being given possibly university-level grade questions, and Katsuki had a sneaking suspicion that he may easily answer a lot of those questions. He noticed that Izumi always had a higher grade than Deku, which should be impossible, with her unmotivated and ignorant personality and attitude, which gave Katsuki the impression that they weren't allowing Deku to perform better than his quirk-blessed twin. Deku was being ridiculed, and it enraged Katsuki. Not that Deku was being treated worse than trash, but the fact he was having everything handed to him. He could miss all of his tests that were coming later this week and still get A's. In game terms, he was forced to be on easy mode, while Deku lived in hard mode constantly, and it was pissing him off. Despite popular belief, Katsuki didn't like winning. He liked competition. Winning was an added bonus, but there was no point in winning if there was never a fight, never a battle, never a chance that he could lose. The rush of overcoming a challenge was what Katsuki strived for, and it was hard for him to get since far outclassed everyone in his school. He knew UA would be a challenge, but that knowledge didn't help restrain the bubbling anger Katsuki was known for. The only person in his entire district that could pose even a threat to Katsuki was Deku. He was intelligent, and Katsuki seemed to be the only person with the brain to acknowledge it. It wasn't even his academic prowess that Katsuki was intimidated by, it was his incredible quick wit. He had seen Deku's outsmart his classmates attempted time and time again by manipulating their weaknesses and following patterns they always display. A lot of the dumb SHD Katsuki knows his classmate do is simply from him noticing Deku take advantage of it, which meant Deku noticed it first, and that was insulting. The primary example that always popped back into Katsuki's head was when Deku took advantage of Izumi's reliance of sight for her quirk. He had assumed she didn't need to, and he was correct in that assumption. She didn't need to see for her quirk to work, but if she couldn't, she was as scary as legless deer. He watched Deku pull Izumi's head back with his feet as she sat on his chest. She had glowing green electric energy blasts hovering above her. Izumi's head was jolted back, and in panic she shot out her kinetically infused projectiles. However, despite her target literally being directly beneath her, all of her electric bullets missed, and not barely. Katsuki was almost hit by one, and he was a far distance on her left. Deku further took advantage of Izumi's blindness and covered her head with a piece of cloth. Deku easily pushed off his mounted prune sibling and sprinted out of the room with no contestation. It was pathetic. He already knew Izumi was a useless sleaze who was only popular thanks to her wealth, but witnessing that only strengthened his resolve to despise her. Izumi wasn't intelligent. She had no tenacity, and she lacked skill in both physical and quirk fighting. The only things Izumi had on her side was her wealth and quirk being stronger than the average 14-year-old. Sure, she had power on her side, but without any skill, she'd get flattened before she would get out of high school. Katsuki hated her cocky attitude. He may be egotistical, but at least he could back up his claims of superiority. Izumi couldn't. She was the equivalent of a blind rodent. Disgusting. He felt like he should feel bad for Deku. As an inspiring hero, Katsuki felt like he had the duty to help. But he couldn't remove his feeling of pure hatred towards the smaller boy. Why? It was because Katsuki was scared. He was scared that Deku would be proven better than him. A boy who he had been instructed to stay away from since he was a failure. A disease-infested freak who would ultimately amount to nothing. But that could very much be wrong. Everyone around Katsuki that was letting him take the easy road to life were doing everything in their power to knock Deku down. Yet, a decade later, Deku was not lying down. He was like a punching bag who never fought back, but always got back up, and Katsuki was afraid of the day that Deku decided to no longer be complacent, and that fear has made him act violently against him. Katsuki felt sick of himself for doing this, for acting like a coward, but the nagging feeling of fear was overwhelming his want for a challenge. He didn't want to be shown up by someone who was supposed to be useless. Imagine, he the great Katsuki Bakugo, failing, while Deku, the quirkless nothing succeeded. He wouldn't be able to handle that. So instead of helping Deku for a challenge, he tried to prevent Deku from ever challenging him. He'd corner Deku in places where there was no escape. He'd force the boy to be afraid by getting him on the ground and making him unable to get back up. Threats, injuries, destruction were all methods Katsuki used against Deku to stop him from trying to be a hero, to stop trying to challenge him at heroism. Because if Deku succeeded, then the boy would be looking down on him, and Katsuki hated being looked down on. But yesterday he felt as if he had gone too far. He did his usual act of insulting and threatening, even to go as far as suicide baiting. It was new for him, but he had heard others do it, so he felt free to do it himself. Deku had literal death threats scribed into his desk. The boy would be fine. But he found something that was dear to Deku, a small robot in a large silver container. Katsuki was astounded to see it, and for the brief moment his eyes had the opportunity to view, he could tell it was handcrafted, a creation Deku had made. Katsuki had destroyed things Izuku had made before. Just mere seconds ago, he had blown up Izuku's notebook for heroism in the future and ideas for Overwatch gadgets. He did feel slightly bad about that one, but believed it was best for Deku to stop putting his hope into a dead organization that was now nothing more than criminals and mercenaries. But when the tiny robot slumped onto the floor, Deku dove for it and shielded his small creation from Katsuki with his life. "Please," Deku had said. Despite it only being one word, Katsuki perfectly understood it to be a plea. He hated Deku, but not maliciously, just out of fear, and by destroying one of the few things he cared deeply for was something Katsuki had no intention to do. So, he left and made his extras leave as well. They were too stupid to have restrained. He knew Deku was hurt, but brushed it off. It was for the best for both of them. The further Deku was away from him was better. He fully expected Deku to be bouncing back tomorrow like he usually did, but instead, Katsuki saw an empty seat. Deku's empty seat, and that was something Katsuki had never seen. Deku never missed a day. He remembered the boy coming in impaled with a large wooden object in his back, or literally dead on his feet. He wore masks a lot to possibly protect everyone else around from getting sick. Deku made a point to be at school every day, except he didn't show up today. The bell rung and noise filtered the classroom as many people voiced their excitement to get out of school. Katsuki had a nagging sense of guilt, but washed it away and prepared himself to leave. He looked over to the door, and he spotted long green hair WHB around the corner. Katsuki hated Izumi but held a strange semblance of respect for her brother, and deep down, he cared. He was just too much of a coward to confront it directly, so he'll do it indirectly. Katsuki slung his bag over his shoulder and gave strong strides out of the door. He turned the corner to see Izumi was still wandering down the hall, messing with the edges of her fluffy hair. Katsuki moved faster, and he began to hear that Izumi was humming. It was something that she did often, and it never failed to annoy Katsuki, so he decided to yell out to shut her up. "Oi, Yagi. Can it?" Katsuki gritted out as he stomped over to her with his hands shoved down deep onto his pockets. Izumi whipped her head around in mild surprise at the sudden growl made towards her. Her green locks flipped in front of her and fell over her eyes. Quickly, she brushed them away and looked at Katsuki with a wide-eyed, dopey expression. "Bakugo? What happened?" Izumi asked, somewhat scared. She saw Katsuki as a rival, one with a bit of an anger problem. He had never attacked her, but was unsure of what she could do to stop him if he tried. She was strong, and that was something she knew and was proud of, but explosions hurt, badly. "F off, Buzzy," Katsuki spat, his eyes narrowing as he approached her. "Where's your brother?" Katsuki asked, finally saying the real question he wanted to know. Izumi raised her eyebrow at Katsuki, and her lips dipped down. "You mean Deku?" I've got no clue," Izumi answered, and Katsuki could tell she was being honest. She was a horrible liar. "No, I mean your brother," Katsuki responded, his eyes contorted into a glare. Again, Katsuki watched Izumi's face turn into surprise. She really was an airhead. "What are you trying to say, Kachin?" Izumi asked. Katsuki let a low growl reverberate through his throat. He despised that name. A childish nickname Deku had stuck to for years until he stopped referring to Katsuki at all. Not even using his name, just whining at him to stop or go away. But at least he respected Deku. He never liked Izumi. Not even as children. He was friends with Deku, not Izumi. "Don't call me that, and don't act even dumber than what you already are. I hate Deku for a reason, but I don't know yours. If anything, you should be caring and helping him. Yet all you do is grin and attack him," Katsuki stated, directly telling Izumi his true intention of speaking to her. He observed her lips quiver, and pure confusion racked through the girl's head. Izumi then hardened her face before crossing her arms over her chest. "Well, he's an embarrassment. How could I have a quirkless weakling, and everything I'm doing is teaching him a lesson? Someone needs to teach him to stay in his place. Besides, you aren't the best at being his friend either, Kachin," she mocked, stinging her words together to specifically get on Katsuki's nerves. A tick mark appeared on Katsuki's forehead. "Do you even pay attention to what's happening around you?" Katsuki snarled through gritted teeth. The sudden action and words startled Izumi, and her random burst of confidence quickly shattered right back down. "You think Deku is weaker than you, and quirk-wise definitely, but for someone who claims to be the best you get your butt handed to him all the time." Katsuki mauled, his eyes starting to shake animalistically. "No, I do know." Izumi attempted to refute, but her wails of defense landed on deaf ears as Katsuki shouted back at her. "You practically fail every test you take. Your Fing grades constantly are flipped with Deku's to make yourself seem better. You can't deny that you've seen how fast he answers those bullshit university grade questions while you've got a reading capability that of a dog. Even with your so-called powerful quirk, your useless brother outwits your grasps and makes it out of here scot-free. You have everybody at your feet worshipping greatness that you simply don't have. I'm more fearful of your brother being a better hero than me than you are, Buzzy." Katsuki yelled. School may have just ended, but people were still around. Katsuki's shouting had caught the attention of others, and now they were peeking around the corners, watching the confrontation happen between the two powerhouses of their school. Izumi was currently at a loss for words, and her pride was preventing her brain to interpret and understand what Katsuki had said. Deku was definitely not better than her. Katsuki breathed, closing his eyes and tearing his eyes away from Izumi to relax. His tense shoulders dropped, and his white knuckles no longer clenched tight into a fist. He calmed himself down as he didn't want to unleash his fury on school grounds, and especially not against a snobbish prick with money that would ruin his chances of being a hero. After calming himself down, Katsuki opened his eyes again to look at Izumi one more time. You have no talent, drive, or even a semblance of integrity. You're just a scum who abuses their brother because no one is going to try and stop you. You're a privileged beach and you don't even hold a candle to me. Go F yourself, Yagi. Katsuki spat before walking past Izumi and left the school building. Katsuki made his way out of Aldera's school and started his journey home, but his thoughts were currently being plagued by that small green-haired loser. Instinctively, Katsuki turned his head and looked at the large greenery area at the side of the school. His eyes wandered over to the koi pond in remembrance of yesterday's events, and to his surprise, he could see a certain notebook lying flat on the ground. Slowly, Katsuki walked towards the koi pond. He first picked up the book on the ground and read the title of the notebook. Overwatch Inventions. Although he could barely make those words out as there was a dark scorch mark in the center of the cover. Katsuki held that in his hands before looking down at the book floating in the koi pond. Yellow, orange, and black were nudging the bobbing book with an almost unreadable title. The only word Katsuki could make out was hero, and even that was incredibly difficult. Katsuki frowned and searched his thoughts for what the book had said because he remembered reading it yesterday. Something about hero analyses for the future? Katsuki reached his hand down into the koi pond and fished the book out. He lifted the book out and turned it to hover next to the second book he held in his hands. Katsuki looked down at them, analyzing them, and contemplated on what he should do with them. With a deep sigh, Katsuki slumped his bag to the ground and shoved the books along with the rest of the contents his bag had already been jammed with. He just wanted to get home and cool off at this point. He just wanted to calm down after his encounter with Izumi. I hope Katsuki makes sense here. Izuku was anything but calm at the moment. He was still laying down in the wooden crate on the back of the hover truck as it drove to wherever its destination may reside. Izuku had considered jumping of the crate and making a dash for it many times when the car had stopped, but he always spotted other cars around through his peephole. He could still make a mad dash, but people were certainly going to be concerned if they see a disheveled young boy sprint out from the back of a hover truck. Police will be called. He would be questioned, and even though the man driving the truck could potentially be a part of a gang, they'd immediately let him go as soon as Izuku's quirk status came to light. They'd arrest him on the spot for hitchhiking a ride on a bystander's car, and he knew his parents would let him rot if he was put in the big house. So Izuku remained where he was. All he could do was uselessly watch and stare as the day turned to night. He was still cooped up in the crate, and in a place he could only guess was far from home. But with nightfall came less traffic, which equaled an opportunity for Izuku to sprint for the hills. All he had to do was just wait a few moments longer, bide his time until the car stopped. At the next red light, Izuku could be home free and away from a potential psychopath. That was all he wanted and needed to achieve. Izuku had lost track of time, but guessed a few minutes had passed before the hover truck quickly screeched to a halt. The repulsion engine sounded, and it wailed deeply as Izuku hit his back against the crate as the nose of the vehicle dipped down to stop. As soon as the truck jolted back to normal, Izuku took this opportunity to try and escape. He lifted the lid of his crate and poked his head out. No one was around which would allow him to run. What the F are you doing in the ROA dash? Bang! Izuku's eyes widened in fright. The man he recognized to be driving the car hollered out in squeaky, high-pitched voice. He was yelling at someone, but was cut off by Bang. Fear bubbled in Izuku. That was a gunshot. The driver of the hover truck just got shot. No, 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 Izuku quietly muttered under his breath. He ducked his head back down into the crate and slowly lowered his head. Terror surged through Izuku, and his heart started beating harder. He pushed his eye against the hole to see despite wanting to cower and curl into a ball to hide. If the person with the gun was going to walk towards him, he needed to be watching so he can try something if they get close. What would Izuku do? Not even he knew. Hey, what the hell is going on? A nasty sounded voice groaned out as they joined the fray. Oh my god, did they kill Jokin? Someone else shouted, and Izuku could feel his BLD running cold. Silence lingered in the air for a short while after the last man's outburst, but it felt like an eternity to Izuku. He's fine, but he'll have nasty headache when he wakes up, a new voice answered, and his tone was calm and collected. His voice was significantly different compared to the rest. It wasn't rough or squeaky like the other men he had heard before. His was smooth and deep, and he sounded carefree, like he was unconcerned with the situation entirely, and that was the scariest thing Izuku found in this entire situation. He also had an accent, but couldn't pinpoint where. He had never met a non-native speaker speak fluent Japanese. Again, there was a brief pause of silence before the man who had spoken last talked again. All right, we can do this two ways. I can grab the cargo you've stashed on the back of that truck, or we've got a good old-fashioned duel on our hands. The man asked with clear confidence, so much so that Izuku felt bad for the men confronting him. No words were exchanged, but Izuku heard a choir of random noises ranging from metal clanging and fire being summoned. Thought so, the man said, and Izuku felt like he had a smile when he spoke that. Attack! Someone shouted, and suddenly all mayhem went loose. Gunshots rang out, and Izuku heard a charging buzzsaw rev up. Izuku's pupil darted to a flash of fire streaming down next to the hover truck. Izuku felt himself shake. He wanted to hide, but he couldn't look away. His rational part of his brain told him he was already hiding, but everything else in his head was so loud that it was basically silent. Izuku wanted to watch. He wanted to see what was going on, but he was smart enough to not dare lift the lid of the crate he was hiding in. Suddenly someone darted into view. They hastily rushed to the back of the hover truck and slammed his body against the back. Frantically, he raised a silver gun that looked odd compared to the firearms Izuku was used to seeing. It was a revolver, and the chamber would come out when reloading as well. The man put fresh bullets back into his gun before leaning back out from behind the vehicle. He moved his arm and fired 3 bullets fast before tucking back behind the vehicle. A flying buzzsaw whizzed past the man he assumed to be the one who shot the driver of the car. Izuku could now see him clearly. The man had a wide brim hat that resembled that of Western cowboys. He was Caucasian and had shiny brown hair that framed all around his face. There was a band around the hat, as well, with an emblem at the front with bullets stuffed in the band like he was a sheriff. He had a ragged and ripped red cloth that was almost like a cape hanging around his shoulders and wrapped like a scarf, but dangled like a blanket behind him. He had high-tech plated armor around his chest that seemed to also extend to his free hand, but not the one where he held the weapon. Upon closer inspection, the arm was a prosthetic, not plated in metal. Izuku could tell as a joint in the elbow pressed into his arm, which would have to mean that there was nothing there. Therefore, a prosthetic. Furthermore, the cowboy had a belt with the letters BAMF engraved on a golden plate at the front. He didn't know what that meant. He also wore black breeds with large brown pads for armor and strong red knee guards. His shoes also seemed to be made of leather, and metal ring of spikes hung from the starting point of his toes to the top of his heel. Izuku gasped, but it was inaudible through the noise of the makeshift battlefield, even to himself. He recognized that man. He was someone he hadn't seen in 5 years. He was a hero to the world that would occasionally pop up. He wasn't prominent, but Izuku knew the ins and outs of the organization he came from. That was the renowned cowboy of Overwatch, Jesse McCree. Don't comment, it is Cole Cassidy. I know, and it will be addressed shortly. Izuku was now enamored at seeing him. He hadn't seen an Overwatch agent in years. The only thing he remembers hearing about an Overwatch agent was Angela Ziegler helping the injured in Egypt. So, witnessing another ex-Overwatch in action and additionally in person, Izuku was beyond ecstatic to the point it was contesting his pure fear of the current situation. Jesse McCree was going to save him. McCree backpedaled and jumped up, and Izuku watched a buzzsaw shoot out from underneath him. Izuku stared in awe as he fired another 2 shots, and if Izuku counted correctly, he should only have 1 left. McCree crouched down and reached behind him. He chucked something to the side of the truck, and Izuku could see the edge of a bright flash and deduced it was a flashbang. A man with ram horns charged at McCree, and he easily rolled to the side. He got back on his feet, pointed his gun at the back of the ram villain's head, and pulled the trigger. Izuku shut his eye to not see the BLD that would be spewing from the back of his skull. He suddenly felt sick, and his stomach churned uncomfortably around the rest of his guts. He shouldn't look, But Izuku's weakness had always been his morbid curiosity. Izuku poked his eyes back up to the peephole before flinching at 3 more shots being fired. Suddenly, he became a lot more aware of the dangerous weapon his hero held in his hand. Izuku glanced towards the lying ram villain, but instead of seeing red like he expected, he saw nothing but the villain lying flat on his face. Izuku did a double take, but could not identify a wound on the villain. It was then a sudden relief washed over Izuku. McCree was using RBB bullets. Izuku calmed down and turned his eyes back to McCree. He lifted his gun to his lips, the barrel smoking from the constant fire, and he gently blew it out. He spun his weapon on his finger before pocketing it in his holster. He then grabbed a large olden day cigar and started smoking it by using a small flame installed in his prosthetic. Izuku was too in shock to do anything at the moment, and he just continued to stare at McCree. As he stared at McCree, he noticed something behind him. In the dark shade of the night, something behind started glowing. It had a purple light and digital form of movement. Izuku's eyes widened as he saw a girl wearing a lot of purple appear out of thin air. Izuku's eyes shot out from his skull, and out of sheer instinct to protect his current hero, he launched himself upward and smashed the crate lid to the back of the hover truck. "Behind you!" Izuku shouted. McCree, despite not even knowing who Izuku was, or even seeing him, spun around with his prosthetic fist raised. The girl already had her hand reached forward, and she gently nudged McCree's nose. "Boop!" She smirked before McCree's iron fist phased through her. The girl glitched and turned into jittery, purple streaks of data. The purple mass of distortion shot out towards McCree and temporarily covered him before completely vanishing in thin air. McCree growled in frustration, and Izuku noticed a small pink post-it note flutter to the ground. He stomped on it before picking it up and pocketing it. "Damn it, Sombra," he heard McCree mutter. It was surprisingly loud. Perhaps the night was echoing his voice. Izuku's brain immediately started racking around for solutions and answers, and he found himself wondering about that somber girl's quirk. But his thoughts faded away as he saw McCree turn to look at him. Izuku yelped before diving back into his crate, hurting himself on the scraps of metal inside the wooden box. "Hey kid, slow down. I'm not going to hurt you," McCree responded back in response to Izuku's action. He heard hurried footsteps before feeling a slight shift in weight as McCree clunkily jumped onto the hover truck. Izuku reprimanded himself for his foolish action of cowardness. He knew Jesse McCree wouldn't hurt him, but he acted like he would anyway. It was just a natural response for Izuku. He wasn't used to people helping him. Sheepishly, Izuku stood back up and rubbed his right hand on the knuckles of his left because that's where he hit the hardest when he dove into the cart. He still heard McCree stepping towards him and gingerly turned his head to look up at him. He was taller than his teachers at school, which would put him around 6 foot. McCree craned his head down and gave Izuku a quizzical look, and Izuku could tell how much older the man looked. Sure, it had been 5 years since he had seen a photo of him, but still, the man looked centuries wiser than the rebellious figure of America he saw on his computer screen. "So kid, what's with you hiding in this gang's crate? Doesn't seem like a kidnapping." McCree spoke, and Izuku chuckled nervously. McCree's tone didn't seem to be demanding or accusatory like other adult figures he has had in his life. But the nudging feeling of memory plagued his mind about what this encounter could turn into. He was quirkless after all, and everybody seemed to disregard him after that information is leaked. But realization cascaded down on Izuku, and McCree watched with mild confusion as the boy's sad face brightened with shining hope. McCree was mentored under Gabriel Reyes, the quirkless commander of Overwatch. McCree may be one of the few who'd respect his status of quirkless. So Izuku steeled some confidence into himself, even if the feeling of pride was small. I was chased by bullies and hid in the crate. He chased them off before getting in his car. However, I saw him put on a mask that reminded me of an old Yakuza group, so I became too fearful to try and escape, Izuku admitted to McCree, hoping the man would buy his truth. It was quite convoluted, and while honest, Izuku wouldn't be surprised if McCree was skeptical. McCree hummed, and Izuku couldn't tell if he was processing the information or analyzing him as a suspect for lying. McCree ended up chuckling and shaking his head in what Izuku believed to be disbelief. "Well, allow me to introduce myself," McCree started, taking his hat off in a gesture Izuku supposed was to be kind or respectful. "You're Jesse McCree, an ex-hero of Overwatch." It is really an honor to meet you, sir. Izuku doted with stars in his eyes, raising his closed hands close to his chest and bouncing on the toes of his feet. McCree blinked. His expression became completely blank. Clearly, he was caught off guard, which Izuku should have expected. McCree was one of the least occurring heroes and was one of the latest heroes to join Overwatch. Japan wasn't exactly accepting of them at the time, or ever, so the man probably wasn't expecting to get recognized, and if he was, it would come with a lot of hate. Okay, McCree grunted, putting his hat back on before coughing into his hand. Izuku was worried he had done something wrong until he gave a warm smile again. All right there, bud. McCree grinned as he reached out his real arm and ruffled Izuku's hair. First of all, glad to know I have a fan. Secondly, I go by Cole Cassidy now, McCree or Cassidy had stated. Izuku turned his head to look up and quirked his eyebrow up at the cowboy. Cassidy laughed heartedly. Cole Cassidy is my actual name, but it was needed to be changed during my stay at Overwatch. As times have changed, I've gone back to my roots. Cassidy smiled, answering Izuku's silent question. So are the other names of Overwatch agents fake? Izuku asked, confused on why that was needed. Cassidy seemed to go in thought before shaking his head. I don't believe so. I was a special case, Cassidy answered, and Izuku nodded. He wanted to ask more questions, but thought against it. Perhaps it was a sensitive topic for the man, and it would make sense. Speaking of names, what's yours? Can't just keep calling you Bud, Cassidy asked with a slightly taunting grin. Izuku felt his cheeks flush in embarrassment and debated if he should be completely transparent. Although his parents wouldn't care if he disappeared, they'd care if he disappeared and come back. They would be seen as bad parents for not looking for their child and furious that a quirkless burden was still in their lives. Since his dad was the #1 hero, he could cover anything up, like Izuku actually disappearing. If he was going to get back home, he'd have to do it himself. Izuku Midoriya, Izuku answered, and he hoped his answer came out earnest. It was a lot stronger in comparison to the rest of the things he has said, so it may come off as more dependable. Or Cassidy could be a genius at detecting lies. Wait, what's his quirk? What if Cole Cassidy had a lie-detecting quirk? Izuku started to panic slightly as his brain once again started to overanalyze. Midoriya. All right, do you know how to get back home? Cassidy asked. Izuku blinked, and his rumble of insane thoughts paused as his mind clung onto the strange way Cassidy said his fake name. He had noticed his strange accent while speaking, but somehow his name sounded foreign. Foreign. His name wasn't even Midoriya, but being called anything. But Deku now felt strange, and Izuku had to say, he liked the feeling of not being called Deku. Izuku coughed, his mind slowly catching up. He was temporarily stunned in his own typhoon of thoughts that it had taken a while for him to register what Cassidy had asked. No, I know where I live, but not where we are currently. I hid in that crate around 3 o'clock, and since it was night now, I'm guessing I've been in there for over 3 hours, Izuku responded. He heard Cassidy sigh, and he bobbed his head down. He was probably disappointed in him. All right, it is far past just 3 hours. Midoriya, was it? Cassidy asked. Izuku nodded his head, not looking up from his feet. You shouldn't trust strangers, but right now I'm probably your best bet of having a good night's rest. My place isn't too far away, and I have my bike, so why don't you hop along with me? Cassidy offered, but Izuku sensed that he may not have an option as the man wasn't going to leave a small teen alone in the middle of the night. Izuku was glad that it was an Overwatch agent that found him instead of a local hero, because if a hero found him, he'd be taken to the police. An ex-Overwatch agent would be arrested on site, so going to the station wasn't an option for him. They'd call his parents. They would come and pick him up and make sure his name was never heard of again. Izuku subconsciously grabbed the straps of his backpack. He had a lot of important stuff to him hiding in his yellow bag. Being out in the open at night may have his belongings stolen, and Izuku seriously didn't know what he would do if that happened. He didn't believe Cassidy to be a bad person, but he had thought the same of All Might until he stumbled on a revelation of a lifetime. Cassidy was an ex-agent of an organization he adored and believed in. Plus, he was mentored under his idol, Gabriel Reyes, who too was quirkless. So out of the options, Izuku nodded his head to Cassidy, as he was the best. All right, give me a second, Cassidy said. The cowboy then looked around and started scout the contents of the boxes at the back of the hover truck. Izuku watched him pocket sheets of papers and blueprints, and he also grabbed some grenades that were stashed in one of the boxes. He then looked back at Izuku and jerked his head away from the hover truck. "All right, let's go," Cassidy said before jumping off the back of the vehicle. Izuku silent nodded and followed after the man. They walked in a comfortable silence as they reveled in the cold of the night. After about a minute of walking, they walked into an alleyway where Izuku spotted presumably Cassidy's hover bike. "All right, I don't have a spare helmet, so we'll just have to make the trip fast," Cassidy spoke as he whipped his leg around to mount his vehicle. He grabbed his helmet, and Izuku expected him to put him on only for him to hand it towards Izuku. Izuku was surprised and was about to rebuke when he realized he didn't have an argument against taking it, so he graciously accepted Cassidy's helmet. "So, after the disbandment, what did you start doing?" Izuku asked, filling the void of quiet with a question, one that he had wanted to ask. Cassidy sighed and turned his gaze away from Izuku. "I'm a mercenary now," Cassidy answered simply. Izuku took a look at Cassidy's solemn expression and determined it would be wise to leave him alone. So Izuku got on the bike behind Cassidy after clipping the helmet on and held onto his stomach. It felt odd as he was wearing armor, but Izuku didn't say anything about it. Cassidy revved up his engine before speeding out of the alleyway almost silently. Hover vehicles have been fine-tuned to be quick and quiet. The only noise they make was a fierce hum from the engine, which only existed in bikes, as they were too small to install the soundproofing cars and larger vehicles have. It wasn't really loud, but at the dead of night, with Izuku left with nothing but his thoughts of meeting one of his heroes, it was all he could think about. Izuku felt something light tickle his nose. He shook his head slightly and suddenly roughly inhaled. His eyes squeezed tight, and he reluctantly peeled them open. His vision was blurry and wet, so he raised his arm up and wiped his arm with his sleeve. Izuku clicked his tongue as he tried to wet his extremely dry mouth. Izuku grabbed the blanket with his free hand as he slowly woke up. The gears in his brains might have only just started turning since he recently woken up, but Izuku had always been a quick thinker. He first noticed his hand was rubbing against something gritty and flexible. The second thing that Izuku realized that his alarm didn't go off, meaning he had either woken up early, which had almost never happened before, or his phone wasn't by him. The second thought startled Izuku and kick-started his brain like he had just taken caffeine. He shot up and looked around his surroundings and found himself in a relatively run-down room. His bedroom looked better than this, and it was mostly filled with junk he had collected from the scrapyard. But this is probably due to his parents being overly wealthy. Their house may look inconspicuous on the outside, but once you are inside, the expenses of items and decorations clearly depict their income. Izuku could only guess the reason for his family living in a plain neighborhood was to try and have his father's civilian life as secret as possible. But now where was he? Izuku struggled to get back up. His body was unusually stiff. His back was tense, and he could feel his spine crack as he got onto his feet. It was probably from him laying on nuts and bolts for over 3 hours in a crate on the back of a hover truck. Now he was in a bedroom. Thin peeling wallpaper covered the interior with old wooden drawers to what hold clothing and other belongings. Was this McCree's, or no, Cassidy's room? Izuku found it difficult to believe at first until he remembered he was a wanted man. Japan is one of Overwatch's largest haters, and he was an American man in an Asian country. Even if the masses don't recognize him, the authorities will be on him as soon as they catch wind of him in their country. Izuku was confused. The last thing he remembered was holding on to Cassidy on the back of his bike. Did he fall asleep? How would that have worked? Did Izuku almost fall off on the ride, or did he somehow stay as solid as a rock as he rested on the back of a high-speed vehicle? His thoughts went wild, but he came to the conclusion that it was in his best interest to find Cassidy and ask more questions, as well as think on how he should handle this situation. So Izuku waddled towards the door. His eyes still roamed around the area, and his eyes landed on his yellow bag. Izuku darted towards it. His sudden train of thinking crashed as he unzipped his bags and checked the contents. All of his gadgets and few school supplies were all nestled against each other in the bottom of his bag, and it didn't seem like they were rummaged through. Not that he would be angry if Cassidy had, but he didn't want to be seen as some weirdo with crappy inventions inspired by his Overwatch friends. So Izuku slinked the bag strap over his shoulder. He looked over himself and found his uniform to be incredibly wrinkled. He was weakly aware of a wet cloth over his left shoulder, but decided to not question it for the time being. He still had school today, and he is at minimum 3 hours away from home. Something tells Izuku that he'll be absent today, which means the teachers will have free rein to suddenly do whatever they want with his record, education, and even his classes. Which means he was screwed. He never missed a day, not because he was determined to be diligent. It was to save his livelihood and any chances he had to go to high school. His teachers had been against him since day one, and they were always looking for a way to magnify problems that he or someone else created. With a sigh, Izuku opened the door. What was revealed was essentially the rest of the small house he is currently in. He looked towards the front door and could see the bathroom. Some of the tiles on the floor were cracked, and the ledge of the shower seemed to be growing mold. He continued to scan the room and saw the tiny lounge room on the opposite side of the bathroom had an antique couch pointed towards a small box television. The carpet in between the two items Izuku just listed was ripped and had rugged green and beige fabric lazily stitched together. Then near the door Izuku just opened was a small kitchen area. It had a stove with an oven, a microwave and refrigerator that all looked cheap, or at least to what Izuku had seen. Everything his parents owned were over hundreds of dollars, and he commonly scavenged for scraps and junk, so his view on basic and mildly expensive products may perhaps be warped. Finally, his eyes landed on the small and skinny dining table with a certain man sitting down at it. Cassidy was wearing the exact same clothing of yesterday, minus his metal pads, his cape and hat. The last two items weren't far away. His cape was folded neatly on the kitchen table with his hat sitting on top of the red fabric. Cassidy looked up, a fork in his mouth. Izuku looked down at the plate of food in front of him. It had flat white bread that was toasted with bacon and poached eggs. Izuku's eyebrow rose up at the dish. He knew what it was. It was toast with meat and eggs, but it wasn't something Izuku sees in Japan. It was an American-style breakfast, and if he was honest, he was interested in tasting it. Rumble. Thought you'd be hungry, Cassidy smiled, putting his fork down on his plate. He turned around and grabbed a plate of bacon and eggs on toast with a knife and fork. Izuku's eyes sparkled and his mouth started to water. It's a short cold, so I'll heat it up in the microwave for you, Cassidy said before standing up. Izuku blinked, his mind wandering past the food for a split second when he listened to Cassidy speak. Short. Izuku thought on. He wanted to comment on it, but decided against it. It would be rude to insult his Japanese. He was obviously a native English speaker. Izuku has heard him speak English perfectly fine in videos and seen him work mainly in English-speaking countries. His profile also said he was American, so it wasn't likely for his native tongue to be anything other than English. His Japanese was still good. It just was a little confusing to Izuku to hear an accent. Majority of people who speak Japanese are fluent in it, and Izuku personally has never heard of an accent in his language before. His brain was still slowly working out what Cassidy was saying. This will be a bit confusing as I'm not going to write in different languages unless the situation needs it specifically, which will happen a lot, thanks to the Overwatch cast being quite diverse. So when a situation uses a language other than English to communicate and the situation needs there to be a difference in the language spoken, I will use italics. Sorry to be nitpicky, but short usually references physical size. The word you were going for was little. Izuku responded mindlessly as he looked to Cassidy. His eyes widened slightly as he realized what he just did and mentally berated himself. He had just promised himself he wouldn't comment on Cassidy's misuse of words, and somehow it became the literal next words he used. Haha, my bad. I'm still learning Japanese. I've gotten decently good at it over the years, but I still wouldn't say I'm fluent in it, Cassidy replied, putting Izuku's breakfast in the microwave after putting the metal cutlery down and setting the timer to a minute. Can you speak other languages? Izuku found himself asking. He was curious about Cassidy and was close to freaking out at meeting a hero of his, but he couldn't find the same excitement he would normally have had if he had met Cassidy under different circumstances. Cassidy was one of the more obscure Overwatch agents Izuku knew of, so that might have a role in his lowered enthusiasm, but it was mainly thanks to what happened yesterday and what will happen in the future. Yesterday he lost some of his Jolt tokens. He was hunted down by his sister and her friends. His dreams were crushed and thrown out the window by the only friend he ever had in his life, and he ended up being accidentally kidnapped by a Yakuza group he thought was disbanded. All of that would be good enough to drown Izuku's potential joy, but add on to the fact that his disappearance would probably permanently ruin his life. Izuku didn't want to think about that yet, because if he did, he'd start freaking out, and he didn't want to put that burden on Cassidy. Well, how about this? We play a game of questions, Cassidy suggests, turning around to look at Izuku. Izuku pursed his lips, and his brain racked for an answer for what the game questions entailed. It was definitely an American thing, but Izuku could take a wild guess on what the game would be about. It wasn't hard. He doubted the game would be anything but asking questions. Sure, what does this game entail exactly? Izuku responded, deciding to sit down and wait for his breakfast and start the game that Cassidy wanted to play. Now that Izuku thinks about it, the game was probably going to be more of an interrogation. Well, we go back and forth asking questions about the other person. Usually there is punishments for avoiding the question, but I won't make you do that. But I'll still hold myself to that rule with this. Cassidy started explaining to Izuku. He stepped towards the fridge, and Izuku watched him grab out a small glass bottle filled with red sauce. Carolina Reaper, it was the hottest sauce in the world a decade ago, but has since been passed multiple times. However, this one still has flavor and is actually affordable, so I'll just use this. Do you want water or some orange juice while I'm here? Cassidy says, turning back to Izuku to ask if he wanted a drink. Orange juice please. Izuku found himself meekly asking. He had never drunk orange juice before and wanted to know what it tasted like. He felt it was embarrassing to admit to Cassidy that he had never had orange juice before, so he didn't say anything about it. Cassidy nods his head and grabs a cup that was also in the fridge, probably to keep it cold. Cassidy poured orange juice into the cup and put the carton back into the fridge. However, Izuku noticed that with the hand that put the orange juice away, he pulled out a can of beer. Wasn't it early for beer? Izuku had thought it was still morning. He reached down for his phone in his pocket only to skim his breathes and feel no bump around his pocket. Izuku's eyes bulged as he looked down to check with his eyes, but still didn't see any bump in his pocket. Oh right, no phone. Izuku remembered. He looked back up to Cassidy, slightly nervous as he wanted to know where his phone was, and was slightly scared at the reason to why he didn't have it. Mr. Cassidy, do you know where my phone is? Izuku asked. Cassidy stopped and visibly deflated, and Izuku worried that he had done something wrong. Just Cassidy, kid. Mr. makes it seem like I've achieved SHD in my life. Anyway, I have your phone because it was blaring at 6:30 in the morning, and you slept right through it. I tried turning it off to let you sleep, but it was kind of difficult, Cassidy answered, walking out of the small kitchen area towards the couch. You just pressed the button? Izuku voiced the obvious answer, confused on why that wouldn't work. Well, that is how it normally works. It just was a little difficult, Cassidy said with a bit of apprehension. Izuku looked at him oddly and looked over to see Cassidy hand Izuku's phone back. Izuku took it in his hand, and he immediately saw the problem. His phone screen was demolished. There was more cracks than screen on his phone, and even the home button was cracked. This wouldn't be working anytime soon. Did you find it like this? Izuku asked. Yeah. If you don't remember when it happened, my best guess is when you were in that box full of metal stuff, Cassidy said sympathetically as he stepped back. Izuku sighed and put the phone down on the table next to him. There wasn't anything special about that phone or important things on it, but Izuku would have preferred to keep it. It's whatever, nothing special was on it anyway, Izuku said, forcing himself to smile up at Cassidy. Sure kid, Cassidy answered, and Izuku couldn't tell if his tone didn't believe him or if he just didn't care. He wouldn't be surprised at which one it is. He was pathetic. The microwave beeped and Cassidy took the heated plate of food out and placed it in front of Izuku along with a knife and fork. Izuku looked up to Cassidy, nodded his head with a small smile before devouring the plate of food in front of him. Izuku heard Cassidy chuckle, and in the back of his mind, a dark thought told him that he was mocking him, that Cassidy was waiting to take it away from him so he could laugh at him. But he pushed it away. He was relishing at eating food that had been cooked by another person. He couldn't remember the last time someone had done this for him. It was small, but to Izuku, this was something monumental. You sure were hungry, Midoriya. Did you not eat before diving into that wooden box? Cassidy laughed, taking a swig of his beer. Isn't it too early for that? Izuku questioned with a mouthful of food. Cassidy shrugged, still drinking his beer. He took a few more sips before putting the can down. It's high noon somewhere in the world now, was his response. Izuku found himself confused again and tilted his head. What did high noon mean? That was something Izuku had never heard of. Was it a made-up word? Perhaps Cassidy has mispronounced something. He was going to inquire, but couldn't thanks to several bites worth of food being held tightly behind his lips. The game, almost forgot. Cassidy suddenly exclaimed out of nowhere. Izuku flinched slightly at the sudden change in atmosphere. It did not go unnoticed by Cassidy. You asked before whether I could speak other languages, right? Cassidy tried to confirm. Izuku tried to quickly swallow the contents of food in his mouth, but the pile was just too large to be forced down his gullet. So Izuku just responded with a nod. All right, I'm American, so English is my first language. I would call myself bilingual, but only just. I'm pretty good at Spanish and Japanese, but not quite enough to be fluent. Well, depending on how stern you want to be. I also know a few swears in Egyptian Arabic. Cassidy smiles, expressing slight giddiness at that last part. Perhaps good memories, or something, Izuku reasoned. All right, when you're ready, you can answer my question, then we repeat until we're satisfied with the game. What hobbies do you have? Cassidy asked. Izuku nodded his head, curious as to why he was asking a general question before making the conclusion that Cassidy was building trust. He thanked the man for doing that as he finished his mouth of food before answering the cowboy agent. Well, there are two things I enjoy doing. Building things and analyzing heroes and their quirks and stuff, Izuku nervously admitted. He kept his gadget-making hobby a secret because he knew his stuff would get destroyed if he ever admitted it out loud or someone accidentally found out about it. His second interest in analyzing heroes and quirks wasn't something he could hide as easily, mainly because it was a hobby of his before his quirklessness became apparent. I could have guessed that second one. Not many kids your age take interest in Overwatch at all, and I'm fairly unknown. Also, if you'd be open to it, I wouldn't mind taking a look at your gadget designs. Cassidy smiled warmly at Izuku. The young boy felt his cheeks burn and embarrassment welled around him. Cassidy was being so nice to him. It was strange having an adult care for him at all. Izuku never realized how much he needed something like this to happen to him. Maybe another time, Izuku managed to rasp out with glowing cheeks. Cassidy laughed and reached his mechanical arm over to Izuku. He ruffled the boy's hair, and Izuku froze at the touch. For a second, he thought he was going to get hit, but despite how hard the hand was, Cassidy's hand felt loose and gentle. However, the connection was only brief as Cassidy reeled his arm back and away quite quickly. Your turn, kid. Cassidy coughed, making Izuku perk up. His first instinct was to ask about his quirk since it was not information Izuku had, or at least at the top of his head. However, he paused. If he asked that question to Cassidy, in response he might ask the same thing. The word quirkless was practically a slur in this country, and you'd get sneers and death stares if you got referred to be as useless as a quirkless, joke or not. But Cassidy worked with Gabriel Reyes, a quirkless agent of Overwatch and second in command. He read he was mentored under him, so surely Cassidy wouldn't care if he was quirkless. He'd have two. Izuku needed him too. To have at least one person in the world who didn't care. Can I ask what your quirk is? Izuku bravened up and sheepishly asked Cassidy. He put the last bite of his breakfast into his mouth to ignore the sense of dread that pooled around him when Cassidy inevitably asked him that same question in return. Of course, my quirk is called observation. It's hard to explain in Japanese, but I'll try. I see the world the same way as you do. However, when it is time for my brain to process what I saw, things in the edge of my eyes are processed the same way as if I was looking straight at them. I can make out details better at farther distances, as well as hear things surprisingly clearly. It may seem like a weak quirk, but an unforeseen ability this quirk gives is foresight. Roughly, it's more so I can guess someone's actions before they make them. Helps that I also have a faster reaction time. Cassidy smirked when he finished his answer. Izuku was practically sparkling with delight. It was such a simple quirk, but its applications of use were endless. Having spectacular vision was a power many people underestimated, believing to be a simple buff in video game terms. Incredible. Is there any downside to your quirk? Izuku asked excitedly. He reached towards his bag and unzipped it to reach inside. His hand rummaged around mindlessly in his bag before he suddenly realized his books were not in his bag. Izuku's smile slowly withered, and he put his bag back. Don't know what incredible means, but I'll guess it's something good. Well, my quirk does have a weakness. It just doesn't work at night, Cassidy states bluntly, taking another swig of his beer. Izuku corked an eyebrow at that which Cassidy noticed. My quirk only has an effect if the sun is up, No clue why. My parents didn't have a weakness like that. But it also grants me the bonus of being stronger the higher the sun is in the sky. Cassidy responded, putting his beard down before cracking his right hand. Izuku was surprised with that answer. His vision quirk gets stronger. How does that work? Izuku wanted to ask more, but he could see Cassidy trying to think of his next question, so he kept his mouth shut. Izuku began dreading the inevitable question of his quirk. It was strange. There was a voice in the back of his head telling him he wouldn't mock him, which was new to Izuku. Usually, the voice would tell him that he was weak and pathetic. But that voice did nothing to quell the doubt he was feeling. Why do you admire us Overwatch agents? Do your parents like us? Cassidy asked next. Izuku blinked, not expecting that question, but he quickly washed his confusion away and brandished a nervous smile, slightly relieved that he didn't have to admit his quirk defectiveness. No, they aren't fans of Overwatch, even before the disbandment. Japan is one of the countries that don't appreciate Overwatch. Izuku nervously spoke out, rubbing his hands against each other under the table. Cassidy nodded, but his face was still scrunched in thought. Interesting. How did you become a fan in a place with everyone against us? Cassidy inquired further. Izuku sheepishly laughed and turned his hand away, scratching the bottom of his cheek. I made the decision you guys weren't bad on my own. What first got me into Overwatch was a video of Reinhardt yelling, "Get behind my shield," and saving the day. I guess I got addicted to the many personalities Overwatch had from that point forward, Izuku admitted, his mind racing on what he should and should not admit. He could say that he lost faith in heroes, so he gravitated towards the company his parents had a vendetta against, but more personal information would have to be shared, and he wasn't sure if he would be willing to say that. Haha, Reinhardt does have that kind of impact. Loud and proud, we always said. Your turn, kid, Cassidy laughs, likely reminiscing in his time at Overwatch with his friends and co-workers. Izuku nods his head and starts to think. He wanted to ask questions he knew he'd get answers to, so he wouldn't waste his round. However, his mind was currently blank and no immediate questions were coming to his head. Izuku was starting to internally panic. This was his moment, his one chance to ask an idol of his some questions. Not only that, he was talking with a person who wasn't hellbent on insulting and belittling him. This could be his one chance in his life to have a genuine and nice interaction with another human being, and he didn't want to waste this. Izuku tried racking his brain for any possible question and eventually remembered something curious he heard Cassidy state before. What does high noon mean? Izuku asked. He watched Cassidy smirk and grab his beer and took another sip. Well, I use it for two purposes. High noon just means midday, but back in the old America, we use high noon as a term for drinking hour. Hence why I'm having a drink of beer, Cassidy laughed. Izuku nodded his head with his mouth open, understanding Cassidy's weird term. The words he used just doesn't correlate correctly in Japanese. Do you have any friends Midoriya? Anyone you enjoy spending time with? Cassidy asked, leaning back with his hands crossed over his chest. Izuku looked down and shook his head, too ashamed to meet Cassidy's eyes. He was a quirkless runt. No one wanted to be friends with Quirkless. But he was Cassidy. He would have known Gabriel Reyes, a Quirkless agent of Overwatch. A leader as well. He worked under the man, at least that's what the article says. But what was it actually like that? Was Gabriel Reyes a respected leader despite his Quirkless status, or was it all publicity? Izuku wanted to know. No, he needed to know if there was any place in the world where people like him are given a chance. He wanted to believe, but his hope was dying out fast. Izuku stuttered. His throat deciding this point was good time to shut down. Cassidy waited patiently for Izuku to quell his nerves as he witnessed Izuku shrivel up, his own thoughts seemingly frightening him. Gabriel Reyes, what do you think of him? How was he like in person? Izuku stuttered. His throat suddenly felt chills, and no air came down his airway. He wasn't hot, but he started sweating as his nervousness and dread increased his internal heat tenfold. He heard Cassidy sigh, and Izuku kept his eyes firmly planted on the table. He could see Cassidy's chest in his peripheral vision, but refused to look up any higher. He didn't even want to try and look Cassidy in the eyes as he has a feeling he'll just be heartbroken if he sees Cassidy's expression. Cassidy grabs his beer but doesn't take a drink, just mindlessly holds it in his hands. He stares at Izuku, weighing his actions to determine what he should do. He was clearly uncomfortable, and by his position, He was acting like he was a child being scolded act. His body was tense and stiff, his head was low to avoid eye contact, and his back posture was straight. Cassidy pursed his lips and took a sip and swished the liquid around in his mouth. Midoriya, am I right in assuming you are quirkless, just like Reyes? Cassidy asked. Izuku couldn't find his voice. His anxiety had made him forget to register Cassidy's tone. But he had to guess he was disappointed he was talking with a quirkless weakling right now. Izuku prayed that he ground he was on would just open and swallow him up. All he could do was nod and wait for the cowboy agent to curse him out and throw him through the door. Reyes was a great man. Cassidy spoke, and immediately Izuku's eyes shot open, and his head snapped up to look at Cassidy. Cassidy wasn't looking back. His gaze was off to the side and his eyes were glossy and distant, but Izuku was hardly focused on that. Hope welled up inside of him as Cassidy gave Gabriel Reyes a compliment, and his wish to not be looked down upon for his quirkless status may come true. But as the words properly registered in his head, Izuku's stomach dropped at the part Cassidy used past tense. Izuku gulp, and for some reason, he felt his heart shatter in a similar way he felt it break when he came to the realization that his parents didn't care about him. He had never met Gabriel Reyes, only ever knowing him through his computer screen, but he felt like a father to him. That was probably an exaggeration, but there was still truth in that. Gabriel Reyes's success as a quirkless individual was what kept Izuku going, the only spark of inspiration Izuku had left in his life. To think he was dead hurt Izuku. Cassidy sighed, and his head slightly lowered. He was my mentor, and he gave me a damn good whooping. He managed to teach me things about life I had never considered before. I respected him deeply, which made things so hard. Cassidy gritted out, trying to keep his true feelings in check. Izuku didn't know what to say. He wanted to say something, but didn't know what. He flinched when Cassidy suddenly moved and grabbed the hot sauce and tapped some onto a spoon, making Izuku's eyes widen. I'm not going to say everything, but what I will say is that I watched him slowly break with no power to stop it, Cassidy monotonously answered, his face growing dark. Izuku tilted his head, and he started liking the insides of his mouth. He didn't understand what that meant. The meaning was vague, but Izuku guessed that was the point. Cassidy was drinking the hot sauce to avoid answering the question. Cassidy calmly shoved the spoon with hot sauce into his mouth. He pulled the spoon back out, and all of the sauce was missing. Cassidy grunted and opened his mouth, sticking his tongue as he released a strangled breath. Cassidy puts his can of beer to his lips and knocks his head back to take it down his gullet. Izuku was slightly concerned for Cassidy as he roughly pushed a ragged breath through his nose. He shook his head side to side quickly and composed himself. He drank more of his beer, but this time he started to scull it. He gulped it down within a couple of seconds before crushing it in his hands and tossing it off to the side. Izuku followed it with his eyes and watched it bounce off the wall and tumble straight into the bin bellow. Must be something Cassidy has practiced, or he's got good aim. Likely both. Sorry, no matter how many times I have Carolina Reaper, it always feels as if it was the first time. Cassidy laughs, his body language resembling a lighter tone than what it did previously. Izuku found himself smiling as well, glad to at least get an answer, and a good one at that. Okay, my turn. Wait. Cassidy started, but his eyes immediately snapped over towards the television. Izuku's did as well because of a strange static noise, but sound auto-tuned to be pleasant to hear. Izuku turned around to look with Cassidy and saw that the television screen was breaking with purple static before the image of 2D Purple Skull appeared on the screen. The color of the binary data displayed reminded Izuku of whoever that somber person was that he saw last night that messed with Cassidy. God damn it, Cassidy says, standing up forcefully, his chair being pushed and tipping onto its back. Izuku stands up as well as Cassidy wanders into the lounge room and looks around, clearly searching for something. But as the television screen switches to the news channel, he turns to look at that. What was on the screen made Izuku gasp. It was his face. Izuku's school photo was on screen. Izuku stared at his soulless and blank face as he stared at the school photographer who was arguing with teachers about taking an animal's photo. Bright red text was at the bottom of his photo, missing, and a newscaster was explaining the reason why they were having this emergency news segment. Izuku was baffled. He did not expect this to happen at all. Had it been a full day since his disappearance? Surely not. It was still morning. He had just woken up and had breakfast with Cassidy. which means his father, All Might, was pulling a few strings to get him found. But why? He had not cared for Izuku in years, excluding the very brief interaction he had with him in his hero persona yesterday. It has been 2 years since his father had even talked to him. Had he done something wrong? Did Izumi formulate a lie to get him in trouble because he managed to escape her attempt at beating him? Or maybe his father believed he had a dangerous weapon since he defeated the sludge villain and now thinks him to be a villain. Izuku started to shake as his eyes scanned the room for escapes, just in case things get bad. Izuku knew whatever was going to be said was going to be fabricated, so he needed to be ready to get out if Cassidy has a bad reaction. This boy's name is Izuku Yagi, an Aldera middle school student who is believed to have been abducted by a group of illegal weapon smugglers after he accidentally stumbled into them working. This theory is supported by his friends being chased away by a suspicious man when they tried following their friend down an alleyway he ran into and found he had just vanished. If anyone has any information on where his potential whereabouts are, please contact this number. The news reporter continued talking, but Izuku tuned out his voice as he entered a staring contest with Cassidy. So, that's my next question, Midoriya, or Yagi. Cassidy answers coolly, and Izuku winced as said his real last name. He wasn't anticipating Cassidy to discover his actual name. He didn't want to lie to him, but felt like if he got into a police station situation, he'd need to keep his real identity a secret to avoid his mother or father getting a phone call. Izuku lowered his head and kept his hands placed in front of him as his body became restless and the need to escape became overpowering. I'm sorry, Izuku quivered, tears on the brim of sliding down his cheeks, but he kept them in. He didn't have the right to cry right now. He got himself into this mess, and now it was his responsibility to rectify his wrongdoings. He was used to explaining things at times when it wasn't his fault, so it should be easier to explain his own faults to others, right? That is my name, but I lied out of fear of you handing me over to the police. The police would contact my parents, and they'd get annoyed. Izuku gulped as he felt shame and doubt spray over him. Cassidy may call him a liar like many have before, an attention seeker to try and get sympathy for his quirklessness. The odds were stacked against him, but they always have been, and Izuku was going to try and make Cassidy understand his situation. He just believed he had a single person that believed him and wanted to hope he wouldn't have that taken away from him. They aren't fond of me. They haven't even talked to me in years. Catering to my sister with a powerful quirk, they allow her and her friends to beat me. I have several bruises and scars from them, permanent ones. The school doesn't help me either. They advocate students to hit me, swap my test results with my sister, and they add strikes to my record whenever I look away. I missed school today, which means they can alter my record however they want, and I'm not there to challenge it. I'm screwed. It's all over for me. Izuku barely coughed out as the entire weight of the situation finally crashed down onto him. It is one thing to have these thoughts in the back of his head, but totally different when voicing these thoughts out loud. Izuku was starting to cry, but he wiped his face with his arms. He inhaled strongly, forcing his sniffles to stop and his lips to quit quivering. Izuku swallowed the lump in his throat. He tried to look up at Cassidy, but his eyes refused to go higher than his boots. Izuku was scared. He didn't want to be yelled at right now or called any derogatory things by Cassidy. But somebody sent out a missing report of you. That means there is at least somebody out there on your side? Cassidy asked, and Izuku wished he had the courage to look him in the eyes because Izuku wasn't getting any indication of emotion from his tone of voice. Izuku shook his head side to side sadly. I haven't been missing for long enough for a report to be filed. My dad is a hero, and he has likely pulled a few strings. I wouldn't be surprised if that fabricated story is a lie and the actual one is about me being a part of that weapon smuggling group, Izuku answered with slight tinges of anger. He was upset. His life was being ruined, and he knew his father was using his position as All Might to hurt him somehow. He was a hero for goodness sakes. Why did he act as a savior for everyone but his own son? It infuriated Izuku, but there was nothing he could do. Izuku felt hands wrap around him, and he tensed at the sudden action. A firm grip planted him against a stable supporting wall. Izuku gasped as he realized that he was being embraced by Cassidy. He felt a cool metal hand brush the back of his head, and his real arm rubbed circles into his back. This feeling was surreal to Izuku. He couldn't remember the last time he was given a caring hug. The only time he can remember being held was so he couldn't run away as his classmates or supposed friends punched him. The feeling was overwhelming for Izuku. The tear ducts he thought he just closed opened up again. Tears streamed down his face as he wrapped his arms around Cassidy in return and cried into his shoulder. Cassidy responded by holding Izuku tighter. "I won't make you go back, kid, if you don't want to. If you don't feel safe, I'm not going to willingly put you in danger," Cassidy told Izuku while he held him tight. This time, Izuku could hear a difference in his voice. It was a mix of strength and desperation as he confidentially told Izuku this. It made Izuku smile. He finally had someone on his side. Toshinori was sitting down at his dining room table, his head resting on his left hand while he had his right hand in front of him. He was holding something in that hand, no bigger than a coin. It was small and flat, but it qualities of a pill capsule. It was thicker and had a cap that looked like it could be taken off. But Toshinori found a shocking surprise when he attempted to pry it off. He found this strange object where he had captured the sludge villain at. He wasn't sure what it was, but what he did know was that it had a powerful electrical current, and it was what his son used to defeat the sludge villain. His son, Izuku, had defeated an A-rank villain with a simple support item. He wanted to be proud, but he could only be concerned. Why did his son have a dangerous weapon like this in the first place, and why did he run away when he saw him? He was All Might, the symbol of peace and who he naively thought was his favorite hero. Izuku didn't know he was All Might, and neither did Izumi. It was for their own safety, as the less people who knows, the better. He would tell them both sometime in the future, but not any time now, especially with the civil war Omnics and humans were having at the moment. He couldn't risk his life and theirs at the moment. However, he is beginning to think he messed up. He wasn't around a lot because of his work as All Might, but he tried to make as much time as possible with his family. But he missed Izuku a lot. So much so he can't even remember the last father-son moment he had with his boy. He thought he was a hero fan, especially of All Might, but after his reaction to him, he couldn't be more wrong. He was going to subtly ask Izuku about when he got home, but he never returned. Toshinori had thought he might have looked away when Izuku came home, so he trotted over to his room. He called out to Izuku and knocked on his door, but he received no answer. So he tried to open the door but found it locked. Strange and concerned, he buffed up into his hero form and took the door off of his hinges. What he found was not what he thought it would be. It must have been years since he had seen Izuku's room, as it was not what he had remembered at all. Toshinori could best describe the room as an organized mess. Things were neatly put everywhere around the room, specifically put to fill that exact spot. The room had dirt and dust everywhere as if it had never had a proper clean. The room was mostly junk, having scraps of metal lying around, broken items taken apart with some of them looking like they were trying to be put together. The only things Toshinori could see that wasn't some kind of garbage was a dirty mattress, the old table Izuku had when he was a toddler, a stack of books, and an old Mac laptop. All Might was astounded and appalled. How could he have not known what his own son kept in his room? He has not done well at managing his son, and he can assume his wife wasn't much better, seeing as he hasn't been told about it. All Might looked around the room to find any more clues on what his son has been up to, and he only grew more concerned. There was nothing in his closet but old and dirty clothes with a ripped and tattered Aldera uniform. The laptop was encrypted with a password, so he couldn't look into that. So he started digging into the several notebooks Izuku had. A lot of them were on heroes and their quirks, and All Might was unsettled by the amount of detail each entry of the books had. He even had incredible analysis on his sister and friends Izumi, Momo, Shoto, and that Bakugo kid. But what terrified All Might the most was his gadget designing entries, and how there was several statements on them being inspired by Overwatch agents. He didn't want his son to be involved with that terrorist group. How they ignored countries' governments and took matters into their own hands destabilized working hero systems. Toshinori became infuriated with himself as he realized his grave error. His neglect of his son has made him idolize villains instead of heroes, and now he was creating things he had seen Overwatch agents possess. He should have seen this coming. He should have done more to help. He knew what his youth as a quirkless person was like, and he knew how the world stacked the odds against him. Izuku was clearly intelligent, but he had brushed him as being average from his report card. He was likely as smart as Izumi, but kept getting docked marks from the school being quirkist. He should have expected that, as that exact same thing happened to him. Now all he could do was wait for Izuku to hopefully come back home today. He hoped nothing bad happened after the sludge villain incident, but he didn't want to do anything rash just in case Izuku decided to go asleep somewhere else that night. But that went out the window as he got a call from the school saying Izuku was away. So he immediately buffed up into all might and went to the federal police department to file a missing persons case. He lied about it, but sue him. His son was missing, and there was a high potential he was dealing with dangerous people. If he was found, he didn't want his son to get arrested because he had been a bad parent. So he told the police he was abducted by weapon smugglers. That way, if he was found with anything illegal, it won't be found to be his. Tashinori became startled as the door rattled as keys were jammed in. Tashinori watched as Izumi walked through the door and with a sigh closed it behind her. With no Izuku, worry further built up in Tashinori as he saw that. Izumi, honey, do you know where Izuku might be? Tashinori asked his daughter. Izumi turned to her father surprised at his question and slowly shook her head no. Tashinori became disgruntled and groaned and put his head in his hands, as he feared something happened yesterday and his son may be in danger and at worst be dead. Izumi, however, was confused. Her parents talking about Izuku at all perplexed her greatly. She thought they didn't care. They haven't been caring since he was announced quirkless all of those years ago. So, what happened to make them care for him now? Had he done something wrong? Did it have something to with the fact how he managed to get past certain placed way faster than he should have? Yesterday, he made it over a fence that took her and her friends almost 10 seconds seemingly instantly. There should have been no way for him to get over the fence that fast. What's wrong, Dad? Izumi asks as Tashinori stands up from his chair. I'm worried for Izuku. As you know, since he's quirkless, the world is against him, and I haven't done well at being his parent for that. I believe he has gotten into contact with some bad people, and now he could be out of the country with them, Tashinori said exasperatedly as he rubbed his hand down his face. Izumi flinched and gave Tashinori an astonished look to him. Had she misinterpreted things? Was it not the purpose to teach Izuku that he was a pathetic weakling? Did what Katsuki yelled at her today have actual merit? Was she supposed to protect Izuku and not the other way around? Izumi was so unsure of everything she knew of at that moment. She felt like she should say something about yesterday, that he did something a quirkless weakling like him shouldn't be able to do, that he disappeared down an alleyway. Izumi steeled herself and looked up at her father's face, catching his attention with her serious look. Dad, yesterday I noticed something was wrong with Izuku. So me and my friends tried following him. Oh, we lost him at some point, but we believe we managed to find him going down an alleyway that had a small parking lot with a singular hover truck. I think he might have hid in there as some random guy shooed us away. Tashinori stared down at Izumi, a mix of emotion covering his face. He cleared his throat and shook hands before grabbing Izumi by the shoulders. His piercing blue eyes intimidatingly pierced through Izumi's, and she felt like lasers were passing through her skull. Okay, we're getting in the car, and you're going to show me where that alleyway is, and, on the way there, you're going to explain to me why you didn't tell me sooner, Tashinori said in a menacing tone, and Izumi gulped. At least her mother wasn't here. Izumi is terrified of her mother when she is angry. So, this was the end of part 2 of this series. Stay tuned for next part of this series, and if you like this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Until next time.